The book of Exodus records the bringing of Israel out of Egypt and how God delivers his people and takes them to Sinai and gives him his revelation. However, it's not merely a recording of what God has done. It actually is intended to demonstrate the character of God. We're going to see in God's drawing his people out of Egypt and his redeeming them, his power, but also when he gets to the mountain and shows them his character by giving them the law and the tabernacle, we're going to see his holiness. The book of Exodus then can be easily broken into two major sections. In the first section we have the redemption of Israel out of Egypt, which shows the supremacy of God. In the second section we have the revealing of his character at Sinai with the law and the tabernacle, and we see the holiness of God. So two character issues, power and holiness, show up in the book of Exodus. The two sections expect somewhat of a different response, although both is included. In the first half, the primary focus is on Israel's faith, on recognizing their fear of God, the necessary and appropriate fear of God. In the second section, the emphasis is on obedience, that they need to respond to the character of God and obedience to his law, and of course they don't, and what that entails. That is the basis of proper worship, their obedience. So two major sections: power and holiness of God. In the first section, we see the power of God as he redeems his nation. As he redeems them out of Egypt, they are to understand who he is. So in the first chapter, we see the oppression of the nation, that's a teardrop, and as it splatters, we see the multiplication of the people. In chapters 2 through 5, we see that God raises up his deliverer, that's Moses, of course, and in chapters 6 through 12, Moses returns to Egypt to lead his people out. The reason for the shepherd's staff, however, is not just that Moses is a shepherd. The shepherd's staff, the crook, is actually the symbol of power for ancient Egypt at this time. And so when Moses' staff swallows the staves of the men of Pharaoh, then it is a clear demonstration to all involved that God's power has supremacy over their power, and that God is actually greater than all the gods of Egypt, and, as we will see, all the gods of the world. Then in chapters 12 through 18, we see God bringing his nation out of Egypt as he uses the Passover as a tool, as a picture. When the blood is placed on the doorposts, he passes over the house, and of course that is a symbol of God's great salvation of his people looking ahead to Jesus. I don't know how you think about some of these stories, but sometimes I wonder why God does things the way he does. For example, why did God use 10 plagues? Why didn't he just say, let's go, and if anybody opposed them, they were dead meat? Why stretch them out? Why not just one amazing power move? And sometimes I wonder other things, like why did it take so long for God to do this? Well, there are reasons for these things, and sometimes we see them and sometimes we don't. In this case, I think we do see them. In fact, he tells us pretty clearly why he's doing what he's doing. I think that's helpful for us. So I've listed some passages here that you may want to look up, but we'll look at them in just a moment. In chapter 6, he tells them as they're getting ready to go out what he's doing, and then he tells them as we walk through the passages, through the plagues themselves, and then at the end he reminds them again. So God is telling Israel, which I think is helpful because Israel, I'm sure, was not enjoying the 10 plagues, even though they weren't having all of them happen to them as Egypt did. So what is the purpose for the plagues? In Exodus chapter 6, I'd like to read some of that for you. God says, the Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will send them out. With a strong hand he'll drive them out of his land." God spoke to Moses and said, "I am Yahweh, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenants with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from the slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am Yahweh your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give Abram, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for possession. I am Yahweh. If you remember, Yahweh is the Hebrew word that is used as God's name. It comes from the verb to be. So I will, or I am, is part of his name. He is simply saying in Yahweh, he is or he will. And that's exactly what he says he will do here. So Israel, first of all, Israel will know in verse 1, Israel will know that he is the Lord. And they'll understand, they will see it. But also, God is going to fulfill his promises. He is the covenant-keeping God. Very crucial in this passage that he is the one who promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he is going to fulfill that promise. In the very next chapter, we also see that not only is God delivering his people as he promised, so that they will know that he truly is who he says he is, but Egypt itself will be judged. The Lord said to Moses, see, I've made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. So Egypt will be judged, great acts of judgment, and Egypt will also know who God is. It's probably more than just knowing his name or knowing about him, but they're going to see his character, just like Israel has known about him, but they haven't really seen his character in this way. He is the covenant promise-keeping God, and he's in control of all things. In fact, in chapter 5, Pharaoh made a point of saying, who is this Yahweh? I don't know Yahweh. Well, he'd heard of him. That wasn't the point, but he had no desire to bow before him. He wasn't willing to allow Yahweh to have any sort of authority in Egypt, but God is going to show him otherwise. So not only is Egypt judged, but as we see in chapter 12, the gods of Egypt will be judged. As God is taking Israel out in chapter 12, verse 12, excuse me, in the context of the Passover, Yahweh says, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. Now, Jim Hoffmeyer has made a strong case that what he's doing here is not a particular judgment against each individual god as much as it is a judgment against Pharaoh by taking the firstborn and the next god, if you will, of Egypt. And in doing so, he is judging all the gods because of Pharaoh's role, and I will come back to that in just a few minutes. In doing so, he's going to declare not just to Egypt, which we've already seen, and to Israel, which we've also already seen, but also to the world, God's sovereignty. And we will see that actually it works, because we see it with Rahab when Israel comes into the land of Canaan in the book of Joshua. But in chapter 9, the Lord says to Moses this, verse 14, for at this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself and on your servants. Sorry, it is God saying to Pharaoh through Moses, but that did come out funny. Saying, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. I could have done this in one big great act of judgment, but I didn't. Verse 16, for this purpose I've raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. His desire is that all creation understand the sovereignty of God, and that this be something that go on and on. So even in chapter 10, he tells Israel he wants future generations to hear of the power of God. They need to know who God is, because they're going to be his representatives, and they need to understand that he is alone sovereign over all creation. So, what is the emphasis in this? Well, as I mentioned, I think the point here is that God is humbling the Pharaoh himself. to the glory of God. It is Jim Hoffmeyer's work in Israel and Egypt that has really been helpful in this. But God is humbling the Pharaoh by showing who God is, because it's the Pharaoh who has the job of maintaining cosmic order, or in Egypt it's called Mat. It is the Pharaoh who holds Egypt, who holds Israel in Egypt. It is he who is the one who is the gatekeeper. So it's his rule. And so God is showing his rule over Pharaoh's rule. The staff, as I already mentioned, emphasized in the text, is the symbol of Pharaoh's authority. It's the shepherd's staff because he's the shepherd of Egypt. And in Exodus 14, we also see that the emphasis in the drowning in the crossing of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptian army is the demise of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the one who's going down here. So God is showing his power by humbling Pharaoh, the representative of Egypt and her gods, showing the world God's control over those who would claim to have any semblance of control in this world. So God is the one who delivers. The Passover event is the picture of God's salvation, his redemption. And in the Old Testament, this is the greatest example of God's salvation, and it becomes the pattern by which all other salvations are judged. So we see Passover symbolism in the remainder of Israel's history. In Isaiah, for example, as it looks at Israel coming out of Egypt, it's reminding them of God of Israel's coming out of Babylon, as Isaiah 40 to 66 looks ahead to the coming of Israel out of captivity in Babylon. It is the reminder of God's salvation of the nation of Israel from Egypt that sets the tone, that allows Israel to see what God will do. Of course, the Passover in the Old Testament is also typical of Jesus as our Passover lamb. And so we see Christ in the Passover saying, hey, this is me. When you eat this, it's me. It's my sacrifice for you. So we have to recognize that God is not only in having Israel celebrate Passover, remember what he has done, but look ahead to what he will do as well. And we see God's consistency. God is always redeeming his people, and he is the one who is at work to bring about his plan to the good of his creation. So as we look back at Exodus 1 to 18, and we see Yahweh revealing his supremacy to the nations, the structure of the passage in chapter 1, Yahweh honors his promise as Israel is multiplying, because that's what God promised to Abram. But he honors the promise to deliver them in chapters 12 to 18. So he's fulfilling that promise. Actually, the whole thing is honoring his promise because he is doing what he said, as we saw in chapter 6. So in chapters 2 to 5, he demonstrates to Moses who he is, as Moses tries to deliver Israel and can't, but encounters Yahweh at the burning bush on Mount Sinai, comes back to deliver Israel through God's help. And then, of course, in chapters 6 to 12, Yahweh shows his power, his sovereign nature to the world. A couple of the themes that we emphasized initially is that this section is really calling for Israel to believe God in proper fear. Faith and proper fear go together. Proper fear is the bowing before God. It is the submission to God. It is the recognition of God's sovereign working in one's life. And that, of course, proper fear recognizes his goodness and so doesn't shrink from him, doesn't run in fear and try to self-protect, but it recognizes by faith the goodness of God. And so we see in chapter 1, the emphasis is on the midwives fearing the Lord. The question in chapter 2 is Israel going to believe? And the initial answer is yes, but then that has to be worked out as mature faith as they begin to recognize who God really is. And of course, in chapters 6 through 12, God says this is so that they would believe. And then in chapters 12 through 18, we see that they did believe. So chapter 14:31, at the end of the crossing of the Red Sea, as the Egyptians wash up on the shore, Israel feared the Lord and they believed him. And of course, in chapter 18, when the leaders are commanded to respect Yahweh, they must fear the Lord. This is crucial, that Israel must fear the Lord. And so as we look ahead, the fear of the Lord becomes a very important aspect of Israel's worship. So the point, of course, as I've mentioned several times, Yahweh reveals his universal rule by redeeming Israel from Egypt, engendering faith and appropriate fear in him. So what? Well, when I struggle with faith, I need a renewed picture of God's sovereign character. When I struggle with faith, I need to understand who God is. So faith must be built on an accurate understanding of who God is. God keeps his promises, even when it appears to us that he's forgotten us, because I think that's what Israel had assumed. And really what the text says when it says God remembered his promise, it's not that he'd forgotten, obviously, but it is that from a human perspective, we understand that he hasn't forgotten. And God, of course, uses time, pain, and frustration to show his character. He alone is God, and he is faithful. So when I struggle with faith, I need a renewed perspective of God's sovereign holy power. I need to see him. And sometimes we just need to get back into the word and say, this is what you've done in the past. Or sometimes I need to go back and look at what God has done in my life. When I struggle with the pain and frustration that I feel, I also need a renewed perspective of God's active, compassionate presence, because pain and frustration is intended to drive me to God, to cling to him, to know him, and to allow God to work in my life, because I have to realize I can't. Exodus, the first 18 chapters, are intended to help Israel of future generations and us as well understand the sovereign character of God, that he is over all, and that his power ultimately wins over all other pretenders.